Hi everyone, thank you so much for being here today. Just to tell you a little bit about how I'm going to frame this talk before I introduce my amazing set of speakers. What I should say is that when Hauser Wirth first contacted me about this discussion, I was really interested in exploring the way that Ida's work and her ideas around being a female artist, being a woman, being a mother, were relevant to today. So not just in terms of their relevance to female artists, though of course that's something that I want to talk about, but also sort of relevant to some of the discussions, debates, agitations that are going on worldwide. Like her work just felt so sort of tirelessly contemporary to me. And I was so fascinated by how some of the things that she was exploring in the 60s and 70s just felt like the exact same things that we're discussing now. So whether that's in terms of sort of prevalence and production of images, appropriation of images, the language of advertising. She talks a lot about the idea of being an image scavenger. I found that a very contemporary idea. Her interest in what's public and what's private, themes around gender inequality, Happy International Women's Day, her themes around sort of women's place in society, misogyny, sexual harassment, cliches around beauty and sort of the feminine ideal, violence and the way that sort of percolates and prevails through ordinary life. These felt really, really contemporary to me. So what I wanted to do is frame the discussion as being something of a conversation between the panel and Ida, so that we could refer to some of the themes and ideas that she talked about directly and sort of using those as a starting point to talk about the output and practices of women artists and thinkers today. And the women that I have with me are so relevant to that idea. Lauren Elkin's an amazing writer and critic, and her upcoming book, Art Monsters, what a great title, Art Monsters, reflects on the lives and sort of transgressions, if we want to call it that, of female creatives and the way that sort of their work is shaped and born by society and the way that they're living within that. Hettie Judah, also an amazing writer. She's working on a book about art and motherhood, which again felt so intensely relevant to this discussion. And then Polly Braden, whose photographic project, Holding the Baby, again a great name, has been recently exhibited at a range of spaces, Museum of the Home, Open Eye Gallery in Liverpool, the Arafini, and will shortly become a book. So really relevant themes to some of the ones that you'll encounter within the exhibition, or you will have already encountered within the exhibition. So as I said, I sort of decided that I wanted to kind of minimize my own role within this panel and use Ida to an extent as the moderator by using some of her quotes and sort of statements as a jumping off point. So the first quote that I became very interested in is something that she says in a variety of different interviews and guises throughout her work. She talks about how power works. So there's a longer version of this quote where she says how power works: male over female, parents over children, governments over people, doctors over patients. And she talks about this being a recurring theme within her work. She said this particular line when talking about her own family and her own upbringing, the sort of strictness of her father, the religious upbringing that she had, and she says this within a film called Call Her Applebroog that her daughter made, which is a great film if anyone hasn't seen it. And so I learned very early on how power works, and I wanted to put that to the women here. I'm particularly fascinated in the dual role that the realization of how power and patriarchy works has on female artists, because in some ways I think it's an enormous burden, but it's also an enormous motivator, it seems to be. And that realization of one's own pressures and places and expectations within society can very much constrict, but also really ignite. Someone has to be brave and go first and tell me, maybe Lauren, I'm going to pick on you. Tell us a little bit about how that idea cropped up in your research for Art Monsters, how you think that power relates to the work of women artists.
Okay, I'll go first.
It's a tiny, small question to kick things off.
No, but genuinely, something that I found while I was working on this book, which is about women artists over the last century or so, but really kind of focusing on the 70s to the present moment, and looking at how monstrosity and aesthetics of monstrosity, not just monsters like, vampires, but like an aesthetics of excess, of tactility, of like an overload of information, visual information that we get from looking at their work, what Eva Hesse called ucky, something that you can kind of get information about from looking at it. How that was actually a motor in their work to kind of I don't know, make something that felt like it wasn't necessarily reacting against something, some sort of patriarchal imperative about how women should be or how art should be, but a way to sort of make art that felt like their own. And I found myself running up again and again against, I'm trying to think, I think it's Judy Chicago who says something like, what would our work be if we weren't forever defining ourselves against them and their work? How could we invent a tradition? So I've focused on monstrosity, or a variant of the concept of the monstrous, as a way into thinking about what feminist art could be if it weren't forever defining itself against something else. But I also felt kind of like, well, it is very useful, both rhetorically, disciplinarily, and like affectively, to have something to fight against. Like, it's great to be like, fuck your female nude, I'm gonna make my own kind of, which I think is something that Ida Applebroog was thinking about, especially in her amazing like labia drawings. So yeah, I think it's both something that can spur us on, and also something that, we can't forever be fighting the fight. Like, at a certain point, we have to be just making work that feels like our work.
What you were nodding along to quite a lot of that, Hettie. Tell us what your take is and how this applies to some of your research.
I mean, I think what power feels like is when you're on the opposite side, is that you inhabit a structure that's not fitted to you, and you have to adapt to that structure that's created for other bodies, for other minds, for other life experiences. I mean, it was just that really simple thing when we were sitting down here, putting on our microphones that were designed for men's suits. We're literally here in an audiovisual world that is designed for men's outfits, because that's who stands on the stage and has the microphone and gets to be amplified. So you think about all of these great feminist artists like Valley Export, who did that. She literally did, body of work. She's fitting herself in around the architecture of her city, because this is an architecture that's not designed for her body. And so, with women operating in the art world, you're there being told the great art is, it's heroic art, it's, history paintings, it's work that aggrandizes property owners and capital, and work that's about the domestic realm, that's not great art. Work that's about babies, that's not great art. Work that's about your own sexual desire, for God's sake, we don't want to have that anywhere near us. That's disgusting, because women's sexuality is frightening, it's unknowable. So that's what power feels like, is kind of bashing up against these things that, weren't designed around your life experience or your body. So, I mean, it can be, an interesting project to kind of then say, how do we then appropriate these power structures that weren't made to fit us? How do we create a feminist history painting? How do we re-examine portraiture? How do we re-examine sexuality in the nude? So somebody like Sylvia Slee kind of doing these really sexy paintings of Paul Rosano, that's like a really exciting way of re-examining the nude and expressing women's sexuality, or painting Lawrence Alloway in drag. But then also trying to kind of work out what, as you say, what our own language is going to be. How do we, what is it that we want to discuss? How do we bring, the elements of our lives into the gallery and say, actually, this is great art, this is the material for great art. And I think that's one of the really interesting things about Ida Applebroog, is that she's wanting to make art that's about her every day. Because what is actually more interesting than that? And that's also saying the life of the mind and the life of a troubled mind is really important to talk about. This isn't stuff that should be hidden.
I'm going to take us to another quote by her, which I think really relates to what you were just saying, Hettie, which is something that she said around the occasion of 2012 when she did her exhibition at Documenta, which you see sort of partly recreated just at the end here, where there are the amazing extracts from her journal that you can take with you. And she talks a lot about this idea of bringing something very private into the forefront, and really sort of revealing a lot of her own experiences and her very private reflections on those experiences. But this made me think of something, when I was putting together the quotes, it made me think of something that you said to me, Polly, about sort of this idea of the topics that women artists, women photographers are allowed to make work about, or should make work about. And I think you said something like, I wish I could just make work about anything. Men can just make work about anything. But often the topics that you deal with, even if you don't intend them as so, people will say that you were making something about the female experience. And I found that a really interesting way of framing things. And I wonder if you could tell me about the project Holding the Baby, because I think there is something within that it's very personal. So going back to this quote, it is really revealing something very private that sort of exists within your domestic space, your family life. But tell me about also that dual frustration of being like, oh, is this a women's issue that I am commenting on?
Yeah, just that kind of expectation that we have to photograph ourselves, our family, our children, and if we're not, then we're not artists, literally. Like, whereas you think of male artists, they're allowed to go and photograph the world, they're allowed to photograph, work and their experiences in the world, because that is their experience. And that sort of seems to carry on. It's frustrating, I think. But I think also thinking about power, and I mean, the work I made is about single parents, and
we've got some pictures at the end.
Yeah, and the workspace is made for men, and single parents find it hard to work not only in art but in the world, because there isn't enough childcare. There's so many things that get in the way of them succeeding and just trying to bring up their children and earn a living. Because of the system and the way that it's been set up. And yet, that's what we have to do. There's no choice. There's no other person in that situation.
It's really interesting to think of, which is obviously something that Ida looks at within her work, but photography's dual role in creating an idealized version of the family and of women's place within that family, and also your use of photography to push against, you think of how loaded the idea of the family portrait is, and this is a really interesting example.
Space, exactly, in the domestic space, yeah. And trying just to show like the women working and bringing up kids, and the struggle that you have. And we have these little quotes in the show of they're just small, but they're just. So, for example, Gemma, one of the women in the show, she talks about the 2-child limit. So you only get universal credit for your first 2 children. There's no money for the 3rd child. George Osborne brought in. So it's trying to just bring out those little difficulties with little quotes.
And tell me a bit about just the way that you conceptualize your work being sort of received and viewed, and within the context of it being a woman photographer's work. Is that something that you are comfortable with?
I mean, yeah. I mean, there are also men. I guess there's one man in the show as well. So it's, yeah. I mean, I think that it's trying to look at a space for women. It's trying to look at, I'm a single parent. I'm trying to look at myself and other women, but but bring it into the world of it. I mean, they're quite protest pictures in many ways. They're trying to look at the difficulties women are facing and put it in a gallery where, lots of people who've come to the show are like, wow, I've never seen anything like this in a gallery. And this is my life. It's very, in a way, it's simple. It's just putting it on the wall, people's lives, and trying to show different parts of lives and just giving it space.
Which brings us to the topic of motherhood, which relates to this quote and the next quote that I've included, and which relates to your practice at the moment, Hettie, and your research, because I was really interested in this idea of the idealized representation of women, and the role in which motherhood is used to show the good woman and the appropriate woman, and the role that motherhood plays in being a hindrance to women's creative practice often, which is something that makes people really uncomfortable to talk about, the idea that you're frustrated or annoyed by your children, or that they get in the way of your life, is something that is really fascinating, but also I think a real taboo. And it's interesting to look at Ida's work in relation to her role as a mother and
that struggle,
that total struggle, and her institutionalization and her depression and her mental health difficulties, and the role that sort of societal expectations played. But Hettie, can you just tell us a bit about your research project? And
can I respond to your question?
Go ahead.
Because I was mentally going, I want to pick on.
Go ahead.
So the first thing I wanted to talk about actually was this idea of the idealized mother figure, because I think that's something that still haunts us, and it's a big part of Polly's work.
Totally.
Because we're almost set up to be critical of one another's mothering.
Exactly.
And it's really interesting when you start talking about famous artists who've been mothers, and the first thing that people remember are the kind of like, so you talk about Barbara Hepworth and you're like, oh, well, didn't she put her children in a nursing home? And it's like we're immediately judging Barbara Hepworth for the fact that Ben Nicholson fucked off back to Paris to his other family and abandoned her with newborn triplets and an older child with the gas leaking and the water coming in. And she's like, I'm a single mother supporting my family. What am I going to do? But you immediately kind of go, we love tusking, and it's part of the way that we're kind of prized apart as women, is to become critical of one another's parenting. And I think it's something that's still really kind of prevalent. This whole thing of like, oh, well, if you're a single mother and you have more than 2 children, well, that's very irresponsible, isn't it? Do you not understand birth control? I mean, it's really, so we're really set up to kind of pull one another down like that. So I think that this whole ideal of the way that other women mother, something we need to be generous with one another about as well, and to, give each other space, and to, kind of not kind of instantly kind of pick on that kind of thing. In terms of kind of the impediments for the career, I think it's really interesting that my children have just moved out of home, but I think the generation below me has become a lot more articulate about maternal ambivalence. And I'm really thinking about artists like Camille Henrot, who's been doing some really interesting work recently about maternal ambivalence, and this thing of like, this whole urge to kind of eat your child. And part of that's because your child's delicious, but also part of that's just actually wanting to eat your child. And these really complex urges as a mother. And the fact that you can love and also at the same time just feel that there's this kind of thing that's part of you and not part of you. And I think there's a fascinating kind of body of work that's starting to come through in this younger generation that's really looking at motherhood in quite a complicated way. In terms of the issues for an art career, again, this is like butting up against the structure of the art world. It's, there's a really basic thing of like not thinking to ask whether, or just not even thinking that an artist might be a mother, that a collector might be a mother, that that an audience member here might be a mother, and perhaps actually having a talk at 6 o'clock is not very convenient to them because they need to go home and feed their child and put their child to bed. So why isn't the talk at 11 o'clock on a Saturday morning? And so all of the kind of times in the art world network tends to be times that are inaccessible to mothers because mothers actually should be at home looking after their kids. So as soon as you have kids, it's very difficult to network in the art world. That's kind of out the window because that period 6 to 8 in the evening, it's not possible, or you can't kind of just jet off somewhere. So there are all of these kind of structures within the art world that just kind of don't even think about the fact that a collector might be a mother, an artist might be a mother, that a mother might have a life of the mind and want to participate in a talk on International Women's Day between, 4 women who like talking about art. So yeah, there's lots of kind of like technical issues with the art world where the art world just doesn't bother to step up and go, actually, by the way, this is a baby-friendly event, and if you want to sit there in the audience breastfeeding, that's fine, and we have a changing mat out there, and don't worry about your baby crying, we're chill with it. Because it just sometimes it just takes a thought just to say that.
This would be a very different event if I brought my 3-year-old.
Yeah.
There's this other thing with single parents is that lots of the time you get family tickets, and so it's cheaper to go as 2 parents and 2 kids than it is to go as 1 parent and 2 kids. And lots of the museums, I'm always with the museums, so do you have family tickets and do you have single parent tickets? Like we check,
And is some of these themes something that cropped up when you were doing the research for Art Monsters?
Well, it was there at the outset because Art Monsters is a reference to the Jenny Offal novel Department of Speculation, which is basically about can you be a creative person and a mother, and what does that do to you, on both ends. So I started writing quite a lot about that and ended up going in a different direction. And so that material will be a book, I think, down the road. But I need to think about it a bit more. But it's I think Hettie, you're right that there is much more of a conversation happening right now about how difficult it is to be a mother, and in the literary world anyway, a lot of it is coming out of like Rachel Kosk's book. There's kind of a belated
and Maggie Nelson as well.
Oh, Maggie Nelson definitely as well. Yeah,
but it's interesting that Rachel Kosk book, because at the time when it came out, it was so
reviled.
Exactly. Yeah. Whereas now it's this sort of new audience. Yeah, so exactly. Sorry, yeah. Continue.
Yeah, no, or the Maggie Gyllenhaal adaptation of the Elena Ferrante novel. I'm blanking on the title of it, but the one
The Lost Daughter.
The Lost Daughter, exactly.
Yeah.
Oh, such such a good one. But I'm also thinking about books like Dora. Sorry, I don't speak Irish, so I always get her name wrong. But Dora ní Gcriofa, is that how you guys know how to pronounce it? I'm really sorry.
I would say
American, ignorant. But her book, A Ghost in the Throat, which is just a phenomenal book that attempts. I mean, it's poetry in novel form. But I know, sorry, we're here to talk about art. I'm talking about books. But it's an attempt to write with mothering instead of against mothering, or feeling like, there has to be this opposition between making art and being the linchpin of a domestic household. And I think I'm writing an essay on Moira Davey right now, to bring this back to art. One of her really early video films, she does these films where she kind of monologues to camera, or films herself walking around her apartment talking into the headphone on her, the microphone on her headphones. And in the very early films, her young son is there in the background, kind of like doing acrobatics and being like kind of clowny, and she's like, shh, shh. But that becomes part of the material of the film, is mothering at the same time as she's performing. And so, when I say like it would have been a very different event if I had my 3-year-old here, like it would have still been a great event. Like he's super funny and cute, like he doesn't get in the way. I could still say these things. I might have an eye on where he is, but you can still do the things that we do professionally at the same time as we're also mothering.
I want to go to Ida's next quote, which is, I feel like this is a kind of optimistic quote. She's talking about this at the same time where she's making her own version of Manet's Olympia, which is in the late 90s. And it's the same sort of extract as where we had the previous quote, which talked about the representation of beauty, the representation of the woman. What do I think when I think of that? Which I guess is a reference more to the kind of the idea of like the history of art, the canon of the way that women are represented. And here it's this idea of sort of, there's a suggestion of women being, in control of their own desire, in control of their own representation. And I just wonder what we make of that, sort of talking about that now at this moment where I think, we've all just referred to how these prevailing ideas of women's place within society are as relevant as ever. The constraints and pressures of motherhood we just talked a lot about, but also, things that we're discussing now around objectification in relation to, swelling porn culture, pressure on young women today, I think, is greater than ever. And I just wonder what we make of that quote in relation to sort of our writing and your photographic practice. Again, a big question. Anyone can go first.
Well, I would say for mine, so although like lots of the stuff I'm making work about this, particularly this holding the baby, is, it's about tough policies that I don't believe in. It's about trying to show a different side to that. But the women are amazing, and what I want to photograph is like incredible women. Like this one woman that I photographed was called Jana, and I met her in a refuge in Islington. She'd left her abusive husband in the middle of the pandemic, and I've met her there. And while she was there, she got into 5 universities to study biomedical engineering. I mean, she's like a cool dude, and I photographed her, out and about with her kids, and just really strong pictures of women, and I think each of the stories are really incredible. So it's not to photograph them looking sad. It's like, the policies are shit. Let's make it better, but they are amazing.
And it's hard, isn't it, to escape also now. I think there's so many, like the cliches and commodification of the strong women.
Yeah.
And you're like, how do you escape
and
that?
Resilience. Like resilience, I find slightly annoying. It's like, why should she be resilient? But they are resilient. But those kind of words are a bit tricky as well, I think.
And how does this relate to some of the research that you're both doing? Because I think we are seeing a lot of younger female artists, particularly, who are, making work about their own bodies, their own desires, and there are complexities to that. How much does it do what we were talking about at the start of this discussion, which is sort of reinforce what are female themes, reinforce themes that have existed within art forever? How much does it allow for sort of a reclaiming of certain voices? Like, what do you make of this idea of women in control of their own desire?
I mean, just to kind of backtrack into the question a tiny bit, I think that one thing that I see a lot of... Backtracking into the question. So I'm listening to you. One thing that I see a lot of is that there's a repetition of imagery coming through of work that I see from the 70s and the 80s and the 90s. And I think there's a real issue that women's work hasn't been properly historicised. And there's this kind of Judy Chicago always quotes Gerda Lerner and says, you know, until our own history's properly written, we're condemned to repeat it.
Yeah.
So I think there's still a lot of work to be done in actually properly honouring and documenting the work that was going on in the kind of, you know, in the feminist avant-garde of the 70s and 80s, and kind of showing, you know, and kind of having those conversations, because I feel like so much of the work that I see now happening is actually just repeating stuff that's already happened, but nobody's aware that this work's even out there because it wasn't properly documented, it's not being shown now, and it's actually now at risk of just kind of disappearing completely. And that kind of comes up into my own research because I'm working on an exhibition about motherhood, and there are literally, you know, works about motherhood that were made in Britain in the 1970s that are just they're not even in museum collections, and they were really important works by people like Cathy Elwes, you know, which were at the time considered completely shocking. So there's a photograph of her lactating breast being hit by her child's hand called There Is a Myth, and it was pulled out of exhibition because it was just considered too gross and shocking at the time. She still owns it, it's not in the Tate or anything. I mean, this is such an important work. You know, so there's just all of this stuff that's just, it happened and then it kind of disappeared and it got forgotten. So in terms of the image culture now, I do also kind of wonder about how, you know, if you look at these great people like Joe Spence, and they came back and they saw the image culture now, how disappointed they feel about all of these battles that they'd fought in the 80s about, you know, taking all of this time to pick apart the way that advertising worked, the way that all of these, you know, damaging stereotypes were being built up, and then to come to now where, you know, we talk about the fact that we're like a real image culture now, that we're a very image-based culture, but I think people are not very good at reading images. They've almost like the images come so fast that we're not very image literate in a way. So we actually take them at quite a superficial level. We're not very critical of them. And I think we need to go back to, we need to kind of hone our skills of image literacy again, and particularly give young women those skills as well. Because as you say, you know, it's such a good point. You know, I think young women are being really damaged by the way they kind of read the image world around them at the moment. They don't have those critical skills. And
it's so fascinating to think of Ida's work in relation to that, how, you know, what I said at the start in terms of how relevant, you know, her ideas around like the language of advertising and the way that these sort of tropes and stereotypes and ideals are created through the repetition of imagery is so relevant now, and the way she sort of appropriates, and, you know, collage has always been used as a sort of way of undermining image norms, but I think it just feels so fascinating. But I completely agree with you about this idea of, you know, it's also something that you don't get taught in school, right? You get taught how to analyse a text and to sort of question the author's motivations, and you don't learn that about imagery, even though imagery is such a sort of...
I don't think we're very good at analysing text. I mean, Timothy Morton has this thing about like how to read text, and he's like, you need to realise that when you're on Twitter, you need to analyse that like you would read a Jane Austen novel. You need to bring all of your analytical skills to the context of it. So I think we're still kind of very naive about the way we read all kinds of things.
But it's so exhausting, you know, because a Jane Austen novel is finite, but Twitter just goes on and on.
Also, a Jane Austen novel's good, whereas Twitter is just... I need to go back because I actually jumped around a bit because people kept saying stuff that I found really interesting. But yes, I want to ask you, Lauren, something which actually kind of relates to what we were just talking about, but pushes forward. I think you actually were also rereading this because I saw on your Instagram, but I was looking at a 1990 article in Art Forum on Ida's work by Mirasol, where she describes Ida as a global flaneuse whose paintings play host to an outer world inhabited by men, women and children and animals who spill into woman's world at great speed and in tumultuous moral equivalence. The reason I want to ask you about this is because I think it relates to a lot of what we've been talking about a woman's world, a woman's space, rather than feeling like you're constantly existing within a man's space. But also you've recently written an amazing book about the flaneuse, the female flaneur, and the way in which society and culture have sort of limited and indeed permitted women to meander, to observe, to judge, to take a sense of ownership or power over the city, what they see, where they're moving through. And I just wonder what you make of that take on Ida's work and the idea of her as a flaneurs?
Yeah,
Sorry, that was a really long question.
No, it's fine. I happen to have just reread that essay today because I think Mira Storer does some amazing writing on Applebroog's work, and that's a really important essay. She doesn't like get too much into the idea of the flaneur. She kind of drops it in.
Yeah.
And you know, she develops the idea of Ida as a kind of image scavenger, and I think we were talking about that, all of us, before when we were looking at the marginalia room, of the fact that she went into the New York Picture Archive and was pulling out all these pictures and then sort of making work on the basis of them. And that was basically what I was trying to argue for in my book, that that we don't need to read the flaneuse as necessarily a female version of a male figure, that women had their own kind of practices of, flânerie or flâneuserie. And Ida's in particular is about like taking little bits and pieces of the world and kind of assembling them together in a way that works against, obvious readings of images, to come back to what you were saying, Hettie, about how, we don't learn in school how to read an image necessarily. Maybe you do in art history, but that's a very particular way of looking. And Ida's work, I think, is trying to get us to look askance or something. I mean, just the way that, again, to come back to the marginalia images, the way they're all kind of cut up and put back together, it's really working against, I think Mira says this in her article, like or she's quoting Laura Mulvey, that there's no way to like project yourself narcissistically into what you're seeing, because it's like taken apart and put back together, and it's hard to find yourself in any kind of idealized way in the seams of it. So I don't know, I really, my sense of the flaneuse would have been much more rooted in like the city and kind of the urban landscape, or the drama of the sidewalk ballet, as Jane Jacobs put it. But I appreciate Mira's kind of applying that notion of the scavenger, the bricoleur or the bricoleuse, I guess, to Ida Applebroog's
Love it when
work.
she does the French accent.
Yeah.
It's so good.
Yeah.
Sorry, I cut you off. Keep going.
No, that's all I was going to say.
But what do you make of exploring Ida's work as a photographer with her use of, this idea of an image scavenger, of appropriating images, of, I think in some ways, like laying bare the oddity and violence and force of those images and the absurdity at the same time. I often feel like she makes, through repetition and collage, like she makes certain norms just feel like bizarre, but then she also makes them feel so strong at the same. It's kind of hard to laugh at them, but then I find the way it makes you feel really, really fascinating, and I wonder how it feels as a photographer to see imagery.
Yeah, they felt very like prints. Walking in there, it felt like a big dark room. That was what really struck me. But then you're right, you then look and you're like, oh my God, what's going on? Like that head's the wrong way round, and the dog's got braces on, and the cow, why is the cow all right? Like we were saying, like how come the cow's okay? Yeah, it's that, it does feel like, I used to work as a black and white, I worked in a dark room, and then I worked in a coloured dark room. It really reminded me of being in a dark room, actually, and just those prints. Quite wonderful. But then it turns you, with the darkness.
And I think, I guess it is work about the power, because she has this amazing advertising background, which she writes about in such an amazing and often very witty way, her sort of, and distressing way, her time working in an advertising agency. But I think to see imagery appropriated in such a sort of, such a pointed way that feels so contemporary is really, really fascinating. And I think is part, maybe you would disagree, Hettie, but is part of a really important tradition within women's art. I think the collaging and clashing of imagery. I think, going back to, I think it's fascinating what you were just saying, Hettie, about women's work needs to be properly sort of historicized and treated, because, I'd love to see those explorations sort of properly chronicled. What do you make of her, sort of the history of collage and sort of women's art?
Well, I mean, of course, collage is very subversive, because you're reappropriating an image and you're creating a private theatre in which you're allowing these new actors to perform new drama. But I think, it's interesting with her, because she does just kind of harvest stuff from everywhere, but I think that she's not necessarily fully taking them out of their context. I feel that she quite often kind of hovers looking for kind of trauma in things, and she's quite often looking for images that are just somehow off. And it was really interesting when we were going through that room, and I think it was Laura actually that was saying that her child kind of didn't see one of the images as being particularly sinister, but as a parent, you're looking at it going, there's something very wrong happening there. And so it's not something that's like explicitly got like a terrible act happening, but there's just this something kind of terribly ominous, like a real ominous sensibility. So it's kind of funny because I feel that she's almost looking for images that kind of accord with something that she's feeling, that are speaking to something almost that she can't say, or she can't necessarily articulate or draw her own image of, but she's kind of piecing it together out of these found elements as well. So I almost wouldn't locate it specifically as a feminist practice. Actually, it felt more like, I know it's funny, I don't know why, but I've been thinking a lot about Philip Gust and looking at her work, and I think it's because they're almost from quite a similar background.
Yeah, that's interesting.
That they're from these East European Jewish families where there's a lot of generational trauma going on. And Guston's father, I think he found him hanged. It was kind of like a similar, really kind of dark familial relationship. And I kind of feel that there is this similar kind of like harvesting of popular imagery that's going into an expression of trauma going on with both their work in an odd way. I mean, it's very different work.
And
obviously.
the sense of violence underneath everything, I think, completely. When you were talking about the uncanny sort of element, something off, I guess there is that suggestion, well, there's always something off, things seem ordinary, but there's this spectre of sort of violence and power and the extreme beneath something that is seemingly safe.
Of course, collage has been a really important kind of female activity in the mid-century, particularly because we are the target of so much advertising. I mean, as Betty Friedan pointed out, at that point after the Second World War, women were sent back into the homes, they were sent back into the kitchens, and their new role was to be the consumer, propping up the economy. You were there being sold to. So much advertising is targeted at women. So to take your scalpel to these images that are meant to be selling to you, is, whether you're Martha Rosler or Linda or Penny Slinger, it is taking the power back.
Let's go. I'm conscious there's never enough time, but let's go to. I love this quote because this is a reference, obviously, to a period that Ida spends within a facility for a sort of mental health break that she had. But I guess I think the reason I landed on this quote at first was because I was fascinated by art monsters, and I was thinking of this sort of sense of I guess being slightly torn, pulled in different directions by what feels what you should be doing, what is beautiful, what disgusts you, what makes you feel safe, what makes you feel scared. And I think that's something that so exists within sort of the creative practice. And I wondered if this appeals as a sentence. I feel like I look at this and I feel very I relate to it as this idea, when you're writing and you're like, why am I doing this? I hate this, but I need to do this. And I wonder if this is something that resonates. Maybe this would resonate with any creative person, but I wonder if there's something about it and the female experience of just trying to do creative work while knowing how many barriers, both within yourself and within society, you're going to come up against. That's not really a question so much as this kind of opening ramble, but what do we make of this quote?
I think in photography, I don't know, I just feel better when I'm taking pictures. I mean, there's definitely that. But maybe just making work, being part of the world. Maybe it's not making pictures, it's just making work and being part of the world, outside of family. I mean, there's a lot of family time. So yeah. When
you say like sort of within the world, what do you mean by that? So sort of seen as
just
a visibility
being part
thing.
of something outside of the domestic and connecting with other people, because photography is very much about connecting with other people, making work together, collaborating, and then showing it. Yeah.
What do you make of it, Lauren?
I'm of a couple of minds, because on one hand I totally identify with it, right? It's the pharmacon, like the thing that makes me sick also is the thing that cures me.
Totally.
And so with writing, it's completely, there are times where you're like, why is this my job? I'm terrible at this. Someone else should be doing this. I should just, I don't know, get a different job. But then I think there's something so nice about Ida articulating this, because on one hand, it does kind of feed into like the myth of the tormented genius, like like, oh, it's so difficult and therefore it's brilliant, But she's putting herself in the position of being the tormented genius, which is not somewhere that women often find themselves articulating. We can like dismiss Sylvia Plath or Anne Sexton as like, the hysterical suicidal girls, but it's a reason not to take them seriously because they were too emotional and too like in it. But to be the one who's been through it and can speak after it, to be the survivor and to articulate what that was and what that daily experience is, or even, I don't know, obviously I'm not speaking from the kind of place that Ida was speaking from, but I think that it's both risky to kind of cast creativity in that light, but also very, I think, empowering.
It made me think slightly, which is also something that's in that Mira Shaw essay, of sort of, she talks about the monstrous within Ida's work, and she kind of relates some of the figures that you see within Ida's work and that visitors to the exhibition will see to this theory of female creativity, which I'm sure you're familiar with, which is put forward by Sandra M. Gilbert and Susan Guber in Mad Woman in the Attic, which is from the late 70s. And Gilbert and Guber argue that women artists have like internalized patriarchy's myths about the destructive, monstrous nature of female creativity and power, and are fearful about using a language that incorporates these defamatory images. And I wonder, was that something that sort of thesis, was that something that you came across when you were researching? And
Yeah, and I do actually write at length about that passage in The Mad Woman in the Attic, because there's, for instance, Adrienne Rich makes a critique of Virginia Woolf's A Room of One's Own, and she says you can kind of tell that she's like, she knows there are men in the room and she doesn't want to displease them. She's like, trying to be kind of charming. And I don't think that that's a completely accurate assessment. There's a moment in A Room of One's Own where Woolf is talking about Charlotte Bronte and saying she was too angry for her own good. She ruined Jane Eyre by being too angry. But Woolf quotes the section from Jane Eyre in which she thinks Bronte is being over the top into A Room of One's Own. So she's borrowed that kind of anti-aesthetic jerk that she's complaining about, but she's quoting it at the same time. So that might be a kind of polite way of being angry. And certainly I think that Woolf, by the time she writes Three Guineas, it's not being polite anymore. She's, that's a completely monstrous text that is one of my chapters. But yeah, I think that women artists, at least, as Ida Applebroog is kind of entering into that history, have been kind of trained and shaped to be pleasing to, exactly. Frances Borzella writes about this in her book on self-portraits, that you want to, depict yourself with husband and child nearby. You might be, at an easel with, a paintbrush in your hand, but you're a good mother and a good wife, and you want to not seem to be boastful or, overstepping your bounds. So I think that that's something that, women artists or writers have had to contend with, and, how to smuggle in their outsized or monstrous ideas without pissing anybody off. But I think at a certain point, certainly in Woolf's career or in art history or literary history, women are just sort of fucking tired of doing that.
I'm really conscious of time, there's so much to say, but I want to go to the last quote, which is, I'd say my work is about our collective anxieties. I'm more interested in doing something to the viewer than saying something to the viewer. I think it's such a simple and intelligent way of conveying something that is really pointed, and which is something that hopefully everyone feels when they walk through the exhibition, this sense of feeling at points kind of amused, at points very uncomfortable, at points very angry, and I love the work for that reason. But Hettie, would you be of the view that great art is art that does something to the viewer rather than says something to the viewer? Are you subscribing to Ida's intentions with her work?
Well, I mean, this is just her personal view, obviously. I mean, not all art's about emotion, not all art's about political stuff. Some of it's very formal. And so again, I think this goes back to not limiting one another, and also not saying that all women should be making work that's about big emotions. And some women like to make beautiful abstract sculptures that are doing things that are about geometry or geology or something else. I don't know, this is like a really random segue, but in terms of doing something to the viewer, I just think I've been thinking a lot about, I mentioned generational trauma before, and looking at Ida's work again today has been making me think a lot about the current political situation and the fact that this generation of small children that's coming over on trains to Poland from Lviv, you know, her family came from Poland. We're going to be looking at this same generational trauma that's happening again in the next generation. That's going to be the next generation of Ida Applebroog. So I think she's allowing us to look inside her mind to a certain extent here, and at all of the, you know, she's presenting us with this world of possibilities that we can engage with or not. But I think it's really important that we do engage with it, because it's this constant reminder of humanity and the ambiguity and the different possibilities that are going on and the different ways that you might engage with the world around you as well. So I didn't answer your question at all then. Sorry,
you did. I think that's what's so striking about the construction of that phrase, is doing something to viewer rather than saying. Because as you say, there's not that intention to be explicit with a sort of political statement. It's this idea of something that you can intuit and feel very deeply, and as you said very eloquently, like, you should let yourself feel it. And I think that's a really important, it's a very important time to do that as well. With everyone like furiously nodding in agreement, I'm going to open up for questions from the audience. Everyone's going to be really shy at first, but please do ask questions. You can direct them at any of the panelists, anything related to their work, the exhibition. Does anyone have it? Yay! Thank you. Great. I don't know if we've got a mic going around. Yes. Just project.
I saw Polly's exhibition in London, the Holding the Baby exhibition, and some of the photographs are remarkable, because you really feel like the camera isn't there, that you're actually there with these women. They look so comfortable and at ease. And I just wanted to hear from Polly a bit more about how you go about building a relationship of trust like that, because that, I think, is what you touched on when you were talking about photography being about connection.
Well, I mean, I think like with these, because it was during the pandemic that I made the work, that some of the work was made with it was with 8 different people, 1 man and 7 women. And with some of the people, it was actually very short. I only photographed one family, was just once I went, but with Jana, who's there, I spent loads of time with her. So for about the first 6 months, she wasn't going to show her face. And we did all the pictures with her and the kids not facing the camera. But then one day we obviously were speaking a lot, and she said, oh, actually, I'm going to face the camera now, and I want you to use my name, and I want this to show other women what it's like to be a single parent and what I've gone through, and to try and help other women like me. So it's a really long, slow process. And also I always showed the pictures, and some of the time during the pandemic I would just set the cameras up for people in their homes and the lights, and then they would take their own pictures. So it was very much collaboration. I suppose that's the main thing. And we talk about where we would take the pictures, and Jana took me to this tunnel, because she said she likes going out in the evening with the kids, showing them around London. So yeah, just slowly, and through lots of chatting and through lots of them saying how they wanted to be pictured.
I think we've got another, yeah. Any other questions? Be brave. Yes, great.
I'll try to project. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Recently, well, not recently, before COVID, Marina Abramovich was asked how she felt being a great women artist. And she replied that she was a great artist. And I've just, it stayed with me, and I think she very much feels that sentence. And I would be curious to see.
That's such a big question. Did everyone get that? Great.
I mean, I think there's a similar thing with Georgia O'Keeffe as well. I mean, I think it's a kind of, there are variations of that quote kind of going back and back and back.
Ida said it in some interview I came across.
Yeah.
But they're saying it now.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's still difficult. There's still a lot of structural sexism in the art world. So I think there is a feeling that, you need to kind of function within this other world. And of course, you don't want your work just to be seen as women's work. You want it to be seen as great art. And it's very difficult to kind of step up there. I mean, I guess, yeah, I think also there is this tendency again, it goes back to criticising people's mothering skills, to use women artists to beat up other women artists. You know, in the way that, like, poor Tracy Emin's now quoted endlessly about, of course, there are successful artists that have children, they're called men, or they're called fathers, you know. So I think we can constantly kind of go back and use women artists' quotes to attack other people's practice and say, well, you should be proud to be a woman artist. And it's like, okay, that's how she feels. She's been out there, she's been making really difficult work. She was making difficult work for years when people weren't interested in knowing about it. So, and obviously people, of course the press really likes kind of fomenting fights between people as well and making women sound like they're being callous or not being good feminists. So I'm going to refuse to rise to that.
Lauren, what do you make of that?
Well, I think there's a long tradition of women artists sort of identifying being a feminist with being an activist. And if you don't do work that is self-consciously activist, then you can see yourself as not, sort of belonging in that category of women artists or feminist artists. You're just kind of an artist doing your thing and you want to be recognized for that. And I think that's fine, but I think it's also important that we recognize feminist art as not only being activist, like in terms of organizing or, being out there. I think, whether by by nature or out of different circumstances, we can't always be out on the street protesting or spending our nights, signing petitions or organizing people. I think that you can do important feminist work, from the interior and, in a kind of domestic sense, as well as in a public sense. So, I think that Marina Abramovich or whoever else has every right to decide if they want to be called a female artist or not. But I think it's important to recognize that being a feminist artist is a very important kind of political space to occupy, and you can be occupying that without specifically claiming yourself as such. That the work that you're doing, certainly the work that Marina Abramovich has done, has cleared space for other artists of all genders.
I also think there's like an interesting thing with women where they're often treated like you were sort of talking about this, Hettie, but like consistency is some sort of like great virtue, whereas maybe like it's okay to feel different things on different days. Like one day it just pisses you off that someone calls you a female artist. Maybe it's like the way they say it to you or a particular headline, but it doesn't mean that you are like forever rejecting the idea that your work is viewed as sort of being that of what you are, which is a woman artist. But I think there's a lot of, like, I think you said this very eloquently about Tracy Emin, like holding people to like a certain ideal of what they've said, and maybe it goes back to what we were talking about, is about the privileges that are afforded to men versus the ones that are afforded to women, like the ability to change your mind on something or to feel differently about something or to be unsure of something is maybe not often given to women artists because their work is so often taken as like a statement of something. It's like you have to stick with that always.
But also I think, in photography, where I started as a photojournalist, so I was just speaking to a friend of mine who's head of AP, and he's like, we've just sent some photographers out to Ukraine, and I was like, well, how many of them are women? Oh, it's 6 men. It's important that we are in spaces as well, representing everything, not just the women and children of Ukraine, but in that case, I made a whole body of work in the Square Mile in the city, which is very male. And people are like, oh, well, what was that like for you? I'm like, it's important because I look in a different way. And so it's not just, we don't have to only photograph women and children and ourselves.
Don't have to only do talks on International Women's Day. Any other questions? Yes, at the back, a tentative finger.
I don't really like asking questions. I just wanted to say I saw your exhibition at Arnolfini, and I'd kind of been looking at other things and got there, and I had a very strong emotional reaction to it, which was I really enjoyed because I've missed looking at things in the flesh over the last few years, and I just wondered in this exhibition which piece or pieces spoke to you or created an emotional response in you, any of you, just out of interest. So not a very profound question.
That's a great question. Never apologise for a question.
I love just walking into the big room with all the images and then slowly sort of discovering what they were about and slowly being quite shocked and they look so beautiful from the doorway. Then you go and you're like, oh no, but what's going on? So I think it was they're so beautiful, and yet they draw you in. I like that idea with art. That's lots of this. I wanted to make really beautiful images that draw you in, and then just these tiny quotes that might just evoke some emotion. And I saw people going around the show actually in Bristol, and there was just people walking around reading all the words. There's this other part of the show which I've not shown here, where Claire Louise Bennett asked people about their favourite object in the home. And she's done this brilliant collage of words, and I made these still lifes to go on the right.
There,
And seeing people going around reading these quotes that I know, the people who wrote them, and I just felt really emotional that they'd all shared these words and what their lives were like.
How about you guys? I find the work here, which is the physical large and then she doesn't show them. And we were talking before with Laura and the rest of us how I can't remember if it was she decided or someone made a comment that it looked like Eva Hess's work, and then because I think the idea of destroying or concealing your own work or being, I think shame within the creative process is something that's really interesting. That I often get it when I'm writing, where it's it's not even I think something's bad, it's I am repelled by it, and the idea of someone seeing it or having to discuss it is disgusting. So I think I find that I wouldn't, maybe, I find it emotional in a way. I wonder, how about you guys?
I mean, the fragmented diaristic stuff is extraordinary as well.
Totally.
And the idea that you can go back to this other version of yourself that you find to be quite an alien self.
Yeah.
And decide to put that out there in the world. But I think also what's so interesting is that so much of a work, it's very leading because you never get the full picture. And so you're left with just a fragment of something. And then you have to fill in the space around it. And it's really terrifying because it means that your brain's taken to those dark places. I guess that's what you were talking about with work that does something to you rather than says something to you.
Totally.
But so it's really putting you in there. I mean, I guess that's an interesting thing about monstrosity as well, because, when I've talked to people that do props for films, where they say the most frightening monster is always the monster that's an incomplete human, because you're looking at what's missing. Which is why Voldemort's just terrifying, because it's just it's recognisably human but not quite.
Well, that's why there's been some really great pieces on disgust recently, but why things are revolting or disgusting, it's because they're still a bit living. You don't find a skeleton disgusting, but you would find a rotting corpse disgusting, and it's because there's an element of the human and the living within it.
But, I mean, it completely relates to the uncanny valley and the way that we feel about AIs and robots and things as well. But I mean, I think that's sorry to take it back to Ida Applebroog, that room full of all of the diaristic fragments, you just got this this excreta of stuff that's flown out over a period of her life, where she was clearly feeling very troubled, and there was stuff going on to do with sexual desire and to do with baby bodies and and also these very traumatized looking images that are going on there. And I found that because you do feel like you're inside her mind. It was very moving.
Totally. Lauren, how about you? What struck you?
I've been sitting here trying to decide because I was struck and struck. I was just but I really liked the stuff in this room, or in the next room as well, the Galileo kind of cartoons, because they're so funny, but bitingly funny, and that's something that Mira Shore writes about in that essay as well.
Totally,
it's not all tragedy all the time. It's leavened with this kind of very particular brand of wit, which is Ida Applebroog's wit, and it's so good. And it reminds me as well of Maria Lasnig's cartoons. I think they were making them kind of around the same time. It's interesting. I don't know enough about this. I'm sure people have written about this, but the feminist turn to cartoons in the 70s. It's great. I know Maria Lasnig was doing it to make a living because she moved to New York from Vienna and found that people weren't that interested in the work that she was doing and her weird body awareness stuff. And she sort of retrained as a cartoonist and found that she could actually sell the work that way. And Ida Applebroog similarly has this background in advertising, right? And so it's fascinating to see what she draws from that and how she kind of, I don't know, she has some kind of, obviously, artist inspiration is coming to her to make cartoons about Galileo. But it's very much rooted in this like low culture of the newspaper and the cartoon, you know, the Saturday morning funnies, which is also just a very American kind of vernacular. And she's obviously the daughter of immigrants who couldn't even read, she says in the Ida Applebroog documentary. So yeah, I found myself in that room just thinking about like what the text image relationship meant to her as the daughter of illiterate Polish immigrants, and think about her in the context of Maria Lasnik.
Sorry, I know I'm far too talky, but I just wanted to, since we're on International Women's Day, I just actually wanted just to kind of flag up this thing of the self-made name, which Ida Applebroog shares with Judy Chicago, because also when we're looking at the history of art by women, so much art disappears because a woman's name has changed, perhaps more than once over the course of their career, whether that's, you know, Isabel Rothsorn or, you know, the artist of the slave school or whatever. So that kind of, that step to self-creation, I think, is such a strong step, that you're not taking your father's name, that you're not taking your husband's name, that you're inventing yourself. I think it's a really interesting gesture for one to dwell on for International Women's Day, perhaps.
Maybe that's a great piece of homework to end on, because we've got homework, which is the upcoming Holding the Baby book, Art Monsters book, your coming book on art and motherhood, which everyone needs to stay tuned for and read. But the more immediate homework can be giving yourself a name. It can be Ladybird, it can be whatever, it can be Applebroog, it can be whatever you like. But that can be an International Women's Day task. Thank you so much, guys, and thank you for the great questions.